Well, welcome to the last day of FDLA. It seems I've been hearing from many people. They've had a wonderful conference, and I want to make today a thank you for all of you who have attended and presented, and all the work you did to make this particular conference a success. It's been a delight to be in your sessions and to learn so much more about you. And hope we will going to have a great conference the next time we do it. We keep learning so much more with each conference. We'll also want to share with you, we're going to put together the recorded videos. We will probably be doing that next week. So be looking for an email from me that will have the links to the sessions, so that you can go and watch the ones that you missed. Would like to take a few minutes to introduce Dr. Robert Schoen. He is an associate professor of mathematics in the School of Teacher Education and the associate director of Florida Center for Research in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics at Florida State University. He has developed and field tested a wide array of educational and psychological assessments designed to measure teacher knowledge, beliefs, instructional practices, student competencies, and attitudes in mathematics and mathematics anxiety experienced by teachers and students. Many of his publications are available through open access outlets, and he shares data, measures, and replication code throughout the Inter-University Consortium for Policy and Social Research and Open Science Framework data repositories. With that, let me turn this over to you, Dr. Schoen.
Thank you. Good morning. Sorry about the introduction. That's a mouthful, a bunch of words there at the end. But this morning, the topic that I'm looking forward to talking to is talking about just those things, open science and data sharing and all those kinds of things. Let me share my screen here and put up my slides. Okay, I think I see what you're seeing. So my title slide then is Open Science, What, Why, and How. So this is a small group. I'd like to encourage you to feel free to engage. You may simply unmute yourself and speak. You're welcome to do that, or type in the chat. I'll try to monitor the chat, if that's your preferred medium of engagement. But open science is something that I heard about a few years ago, and I feel like it really resonates with me for in a lot of ways. So this is going to be the main topic of my talk. And first I'll start with, oh goodness, it was intended as a rhetorical question, but maybe we could all I don't know, share some guesses. So I'm wondering what you think is the average number of times an author or group of authors submits a manuscript to a journal for review before it's accepted for publication. And that would include if one journal rejects it and it has to be reconfigured and sent to another journal, and that journal rejects it and it has to be reconfigured. Any of y'all have any guesses?
Hey, Robert, this is Kent. My guess would be 3.
3? Yeah, 4, 2 to 3, something like that. That seems to be probably about average for me, although I have been frustrated by some papers that took quite a bit more than 3 even, but some of them that I submit to friendlier journals do get published in fewer submissions. So yeah, I think it's somewhere in there. I must admit I don't actually know any kind of data-based answer to this, only anecdotal. But one of I've been frustrated by some of the processes personally in publication where I feel a lot of times like the reviewers, sometimes reviewers are sort of overstep and maybe have opinions that aren't really driven by what's in the manuscript. They bring in their own biases and so on. In fact, this cycle right here on the slide comes from an image from the Center for Open Science website. And it's basically showing the cycle of research from roughly starting, if you will, with sort of specifying some sort of hypotheses or identifying some sort of important question or phenomenon to study, then designing a study, collecting data, analyzing the data, interpreting the data, and finally publishing the experiment, which often, important questions in science, including the social sciences. When we reach that point, when we've finished a study, that often generates even more questions. Even the best studies often generate more questions, and I think should. The boxes that go around this image with the red font are showing some places that are, in my view, sorry, I got an automated notification here. In my view, these boxes with the red font are showing places where there's sort of a breakdown of this idealized system of science, and a breakdown in ways that introduce bias and can really be a threat to the whole enterprise, and particularly the scientific validity of it all. So one of the first ones, I'll start in the upper right corner, lack of replication. So almost all studies are published as a one-off, and and would like to, ideally, we'd like to know and like to think that our findings might generalize or be reproduced if they were to be done again. But something like 1 in 1,000 papers actually, or 1 in 1,000 studies actually are subjected to some sort of replication to see, did that thing that the researchers found one time, is it seen elsewhere in different locations or by different researchers, or using, small variations on the methods that were used and things like that. So this is a real limitation, and I think it's partly due to reviewers in peer-reviewed journals who really only want to see brand new things, and they seem to be really bored by replication. And I think that's a real problem. A lot of philosophers of science and so on consider replication to be sort of the pinnacle and of what we're aiming for, but we're not reaching that very often. Another problem is low statistical power. So maybe you designed a study, and this is particularly true of quantitative studies, but low statistical power being maybe you have a really small sample and the results can swing widely depending on the individuals in your sample. That's a bit of a problem. I think p-hacking is a problem. I'll skip over, I think, the publication bias and lack of data sharing. I think there's a strong bias by reviewers and editors, for that matter, to see sort of in statistical studies small p-values, and if you didn't have a small p-value, then you're wasting your time writing this paper or doing this study, and that's a real problem, because folks, there have been quite a few studies showing that papers that do make it through the review process are much more likely to have low p-values than papers that don't make it through the review process. This leads to another term. It's often called the file drawer problem, because everybody kind of understands this phenomenon. And so if they don't have a low p-value, they never end up putting in the work to publish and make their findings public. Instead, they just kind of go into the drawer and never see the light of day. And this is a real problem because there may be a lot of things out there that are not having the effects that the published literature might imply that they would be having. Yeah, so there's some things in the chat. I may feel free to jump in verbally if I'm not sure that I can process this and speak at the same time, but happy to have this be a conversation. Another thing, a term you may know is p-hacking, and that has to do. There's a phrase that I really like that psychologists use a lot called researcher degrees of freedom. So even when you design a study, there are often dozens or hundreds or thousands of really small decisions that you make as a researcher about what to pay attention to, about what data to include in your analyses and what to not include, things like that. And understanding that there is publication bias and reviewers want to see low p-values, for example. P-hacking is one thing that is a well-known phenomenon that quantitative researchers may do, where they just they specify different statistical models, or they play around with different variables, or make different decisions about what data to include or exclude and so forth, until they get a low p-value, and then they write the paper on that, which may or may not be the original question they had, which kind of comes back to this whole file door problem and publication bias. And then again, a related problem is harking. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, you may be, but HARK is hypothesizing after the results are known. And that's not really, so I do want to say that a lot of this does apply to both qualitative and quantitative research, although I do acknowledge that qualitative research, in my view, is about sort of generating hypotheses, and so that may be entirely appropriate in that setting. In the kind of work that I do, or the main sort of thrust of the work that I do in randomized controlled trials, this is a real threat to validity if we're answering questions that we didn't design the study to test. So I mentioned the Center for Open Science and the phrase open science framework has come up. These are three things, that sort of tools and concepts that provide a certain framework to think about ways to address this problem. And this is happening in a lot of branches of the natural sciences, and also some branches of the social sciences, and psychology would be the place where it's probably happening the most right now. But these three concepts are pre-registration, open materials, and open data are relatively new. At least the sort of head of steam is building on these concepts. These are things I'm going to talk about this morning that I don't know. How many of y'all are familiar with these badges and these concepts?
I don't know about pre-registered and
Okay.
open data. I can kind of conceptualize what that might be, like data available for researchers to use.
Yeah.
Open materials, I think that's like OER, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The open educational resources are, I would say, fall within that sort of scope of open materials. Or if you're doing research, sort of what measures are you using, for example, and making those available, not just calling them by name, but or by the construct they're measuring, but actually sharing the details. That would also fall within open
Would
materials.
open source journals or open journals fall into that open materials as well?
Yeah. So that's that concept of open access publication, and sort of having things available without a paywall, and without things like that, is definitely it doesn't have a badge right here, but I think it should. And there's a strong push for that, and that's definitely in the family of this concept of open science. Okay, well, I heard that pre-registration is a newer or more difficult to guess what it means. So I'll speak a little bit about that, and that's actually my plan to talk about first. So, any other comments or questions about these before I move on?
I just think it's interesting that we started, if you look historically, you know, that we wanted to share information openly, and then we went to this closed system. And now it seems like we're cycling back to the original concept that we are able to share our research openly with the public.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is, I remember back in the 90s when the internet was really catching fire, and I think it was very different back then. It was all about sharing and I don't know, democratizing access to things, and that seems to have changed over the last couple of decades, and it's much more commercialized. But I agree that this open science concept is very aggressively getting back to that idea of I don't know, opening the gate to science. So. Okay, well, I will continue on. Please feel free to jump in and share thoughts as we go. But very briefly, what is pre-registration? So the idea here, and remember I mentioned harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. So this is pre-registration is directly related to that. It's also, if you play, like if you shoot pool, play billiards or something like that, or even play, horse or something in basketball, that sort of calling your shot before you make your shot is a much higher level of rigor, and it's more challenging because sometimes you just get lucky by making a shot, or I think the same is also true in science. Sometimes you sort of just happen to get a low p-value, or you get a low p-value on the thing that you didn't really set out to do, but you know that it'll be more likely to get published if you focus your write-up on that and not the main thing you set out. So pre-registration is a concept where you document your research plan in advance, including, ideally in great detail, how you plan to collect data, what data you plan to collect, exactly how you plan to analyze the data. And you do all that, you call your shot before you do your study. And that's the concept of pre-registration. Why pre-registration? For one thing, especially again, and I want to disclose that I have a bias in favor, because a lot of my research is experimental designs where we're testing theory and hypotheses, not necessarily generating, setting out to generate hypotheses, at least not at the outset. But in my type of research, it in my view greatly increases the methodological rigor. So if we call our shot and then that's what we study, and then we report on whether it went in or not, that's a much higher level of rigor than if we sort of design a study and then after the fact decide where to focus our attention. So this protects against harking and p-hacking and maybe publication bias, depending on the journal. And I'll talk a little bit about that momentarily. Well, actually, I think I'll talk about that right now. So one way that this can protect against publication bias is some journals and editors have committed to being willing to publish a study regardless of the results, as long as you pre-registered it and then you carried out the study in the way that it was described in the pre-registration. that there's another concept called a registered report, which is slightly different. And I actually think personally, I like it, the concept even better, but I'll talk about that momentarily. So when can you pre-register a study? Oh, and by the way, a pre-registration is essentially very consistent with how most dissertation research occurs, to where you sort of write the literature review and purpose and research questions and a research design, and then you pause there and you write that up, you share that with experts. They give you feedback on it, and at some point they say, there may be a revision process there and some improvement and so forth, and then at some point they all agree, yeah, this is a worthwhile study and the methods look sound, and you should go do it. So that's quite similar to pre-registration. But when can you pre-register a study? The main idea, the simplest way is sort of before you collect the data. It is also considered fair game to pre-register a study if the data already exists, or even if you have the data, but before you've analyzed it, still fair game. Another time you can pre-register a study is knowing that reviewers in journals often ask for different analyses. You can pre-register those analyses and explain in the pre-registration that reviewers asked for this, and you can do that before you do them, and that can preserve the the fact that you've pre-registered it and aren't doing it after the fact. But ideally, the cleanest method would be before you've even collected the data. This is not something that I'm making up or that folks in math education are making up or anything like that. This is occurring across the natural sciences, the social sciences, and so on. So this is an article from 2018 in Science that's talking about pre-registration and so on. And so I'd encourage you to read about this and think about this. And again, I mentioned that most of my personal focus and bias, for that matter, is towards quantitative research and specifically experimental designs. But there is a lot of thinking and development in how qualitative researchers can use this concept to improve the quality of qualitative research as well. I'm just not as well positioned to speak to it at the moment. So I'll stay in my lane. So some places where you can document your pre-registration. These are just two, and I think they're both relevant to educational research, but Open Science Framework, and that's the location in the web where you can find it, osf.io, or the REES, which stands for the Registry for Educational Effectiveness Studies, I believe. That is more of a domain-specific registry for education, and within education, specific to efficacy and effectiveness type studies is their main emphasis. That registry is housed administratively by the ICPSR, that's the Inter-University Consortium for Policy and Social Research, I believe is what that stands for. It's one of the oldest places where on the web where data sharing has been occurring. So the Open Science Framework is sort of very general, not necessarily domain specific. It could be science, it could be sort of any topic. It's kind of the very, very wide open place where anybody can put things in there. And the REES is more domain specific. So those are just two examples of registries. There are many other places, but I'd encourage you to check those out and maybe pre-register a future study that you're doing. A different concept, but very closely related to pre-registration, is this idea that's being called registered reports. And this is specifically within the peer review process. Not every journal has this option, but some do, and it seems like more journals are signing on to this idea as well, where there's more than one stage to peer review of research. So there's a first stage where it's, and this is, I think, similar to how a lot of dissertations are done. So you first design your study. So provide the introduction and motivation and establish a purpose and research questions and maybe a literature review and conceptual framework and design your study. So this is how I think I could answer these questions in as much detail as you can, at approximately the level of detail that would end up in a final publication in a journal. And then you submit that. So you don't even have your data yet. You certainly don't have your results yet, or your discussion or conclusions. But you submit that first half of your paper for peer review. And then the editor of the journal will send that out for peer review. Sort of similar process to what you might expect from a typical peer review. It may go to 3 reviewers, may go to 5 reviewers, something like that, depending on the journal's policies. And the reviewers then provide their peer review and their feedback on the design of the study. And they may, just like a typical peer review, they may ask for revisions, they may ask for clarification, various things that their role, in my view, should be to help improve the study, not to be the gatekeeper and decide whether it's sort of in whole cloth, whether it's worthy or not. But then the editor can then, at some point at the end of that stage 1 process, the editor can then accept it. And the concept there, that step is called in principle acceptance, which means the paper then has been peer reviewed. In my opinion, it can go on your CV as a peer reviewed study at that point. But the study has been peer reviewed, and you have an agreement then with the journal and the editor and those reviewers that if you then carry out the study the way that you describe it and analyze the data the way that you describe it, then and then you write that up and you write up your results and your conclusions and so forth, then in principle acceptance means that the rest of the paper, both halves, the first half and the back half, are will be published. So among many other possible, are there any questions about that?
No, just this is awesome.
Yeah, I didn't even know this was out there. So I mean, it just delighted you're sharing this with us.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm glad to have the opportunity. So this is out there. I don't want to mislead. I do want to clarify. Not every journal has this, and psychology journals are quicker to get on board, I think. But education journals, there are some, and I'll name a couple here in a couple of slides. But I think I personally would sure like to see this happening more. And I think it guards against that publication bias, right? Among many other things, where if reviewers all agree that it was a worthwhile study and it was well designed, and then if you carry out the study the way you all agreed, that it was important to do and the methods were sound, then we should be publishing the results, whether or not they fit into our preconceived ideas of what a person should find. Right? So I think this really protects the whole scientific enterprise to it. If that's my
Also
opinion.
gives you a more of a collaborative style, so you're not working in isolation.
Definitely, yeah. So that's my next slide. So what are some of the benefits? I think my third bullet on the bottom on the left here is, related to what you just said. So in principle, the editor sends your plan to 3 or more people who have expertise in that field, and then they give you feedback. It's like having a free advisory board, right? And it does, I agree, it makes it collaborative, and it just, I don't see any downside. I literally don't see any downside to this. And I think it, especially for junior scholars, it can expedite the publication process, which is outrageously long in education, in especially many of the sort of top tier journals. It can be 2-3 years between when you've submitted your first manuscript and it actually gets published. But you can at least get a peer-reviewed in principle acceptance on your CV if you make it through that stage 1. And then sort of tying back into pre-registration, you also can pre-register that accepted stage 1 paper, right? In fact, in my opinion, that would be the ideal time to pre-register something, not before you've got that in principle acceptance from the journal. Because as we all know, reviewers feel like it's their job to sort of tell you to do something different. So you could be more efficient by waiting until your in principle acceptance is established.
Yeah, I agree with you too, and that some of the feedback I get is like, well, when you did this study, you should have done X, Y, and Z. And you're like,
yeah,
how can I redo this study?
yeah. How frustrating is that?
Right. That's their so this kind of cuts that out. And maybe it should have been done that way. Maybe you didn't think about doing it that way, but it's not after the fact.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's probably the most important, and I should put that on here. The sort of most important thing is it sort of protects you from that oh, you should have done this, you should have done something else, and now it's too late after you've invested time and effort and creativity and years of your life into the study. So some journals that have registered reports are listed here. AERA Open is one of them. It's an open access journal. I'd say many of these, we've already mentioned open access publications. So I think these tend to also have open access, or at least the option for open access publication, because the two things are sort of fall under this umbrella of open science. But AERA Open, Assessment, Journal of Educational Psychology, British Journal of Educational Psychology, Exceptional Children, and so forth. So you can go to that URL there to find a running list. And again, the list is growing. And if journals want to remain relevant, they need to be having at least an open access option, and they probably should also get on board with this concept of a registered report. So I'm going to shift gears and talk about open data now, unless there are any other comments or questions about pre-registration or registered reports.
I just think it's a great idea, and especially for our junior researchers. And I also like the way you can annotate that it's been pre-reviewed, the study's been pre-reviewed. You can put that on your vita, especially like our junior researchers are trying to achieve associate. They can show that they've got this top journal that's very interested in their study. And I think that's a big plus. Yeah.
In fact, that you raise another good point, is that you look at this list and these are some of the top journals in the world. And so they're the ones leading the charge on registered reports. And so I think that's all the more reason to think about doing something like that. So so I would challenge you all to sort of think about a next paper that you write, trying to write it up as a registered report before you're all the way in it and too late to rewind and make any adjustments. And I'd love to hear how that goes, good, bad, and otherwise. But I'll switch now to talk about one of the other badges in the open science framework, and that's open data. I think this is another way, open data is another way that can increase both the quality and the rigor of research. I think it improves the quality of research by enabling somebody to look at the actual data that you looked at, to maybe see if they can reproduce your results. It also gives opportunity for other researchers to do secondary analysis on your data. So maybe there are important questions to ask of your data that you didn't think to ask or don't have time to pursue. And it gives somebody else a chance to do that. It takes a tremendous amount of resources, time, money, expertise, and so on to generate data. And I think our publications are an important legacy of that work, but the data themselves can be, in my opinion, an even greater legacy. And maybe in the future, there's another, maybe what work you're doing is not the most popular thing at the moment, but maybe it will be in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And so somebody could look back at what you've done and breathe new life into it. And I think another really important reason for open data is that only a small number of researchers really can get a grant award or the funding to generate a lot of data. And so sharing data can sort of open up access to, again, junior scholars to do big work. I think it opens the gate to the academy. And for that matter, that's especially true worldwide, because here in the US, we enjoy many benefits in research, and that, including, large federal agencies that have large budgets to help fund it, and universities that have big library budgets to give us access to things. But that's not the case everywhere in the world. And if we share our data, then others elsewhere in the world who have common interests can look at the data and help learn from it, which is good for everybody. So why bother? I mentioned already, sharing your data can amplify the potential impact and legacy of your work. Probably the worst reason to do it is that a lot of federal agencies are requiring it right now. But that's also an important reason, and especially if you have a grant award or if you're going for a grant from the federal government. And even some private foundations are also now starting to require this. And like I said, I believe strongly that it has the potential to open the gate, so that doing research and being a member of the academy and so on is more inclusive and open. So I want to pause for a moment. What concerns do you have about data sharing? And you should have a lot of concerns, that it's not all warm and fuzzy.
I was just thinking about how, if that would make it more difficult to get your data approved through the IRB process, because they're so, I mean, when you fill out those forms, it's all about protecting data. Yeah. So it's counterintuitive, even if it's de-identifiable, unidentifiable. So, I'm kind of wondering how to navigate that landscape.
Great. Yeah. Any other concerns? So I'll definitely, that's the first bullet point on my next slide. So I'll speak a little bit to that. Any other concerns come to mind about data sharing?
I would say two things. One would be, in my mind, a lack of standards about how data is structured so that it could potentially be used. And then the second thing relates to how it secondarily can be used, in particular with artificial intelligence coming online and the potential for it to be used inappropriately or outside of the framework and purpose of what the original research was intended. And I just heard a report on NPR this morning talking about artists having their work repurposed by artificial intelligence and potential violation of copyright. So it's that sort of notion, and it's not necessarily the copyright piece. It's really just the original purpose, intent of the research in which the data was collected.
Definitely. Yeah, that's really, I heard several really important concerns within there, and totally agree. Well, I'll jump to my list. I think my list addresses some of those. So I think there are a lot of issues. So I think one of the first ones is this, if you've designed a study and you have that ethical responsibility at a minimum to, of respect for persons and privacy and confidentiality and so forth. So sharing data requires a certain approach to that. So important term in all of this is de-identifying data, or removing PII, personally identifiable information. And so in my case, that even gets down to when I'm doing this, sort of we sit around and think of all the ways somebody could figure out who somebody is. So if you have a small number of subjects who are in a certain location, then we need to do something to mask that location, or maybe drop them from the data set. Masking the location is what I've tended to do, like group multiple small sites into one sort of unnamed site that I call small sites or something like that, in order to make it difficult. One of the things I have data management consultants that I've hired, and they help. I like to keep the timestamp when somebody took an online questionnaire, online survey in my data set, because it sort of helps me in case somehow the data were scrambled or something. I could unscramble them by wave of data collection or something, and that's one sort of maximizing, putting on our, okay, we want to be as paranoid as possible about privacy and confidentiality and so forth. We've decided we don't share those timestamps, because if somebody's colleague, for example, knew when they took a questionnaire, they could note that and then go into our data set and find, data for somebody who took a questionnaire at that time. So you do need to think a whole lot about sort of ethics and laws, for that matter, related to that. What you can do, there's a small upside of all this, and I have some good news about that. But my recommendation would be, you ideally want to think about sharing your data all the way at the beginning when you're writing up your application to your IRB. And disclose in there that that's your plan. The good news is, if you're only working with de-identified data, so if you started with de-identified data and it doesn't have personally identifiable information, the common rule, which I think was 2018 when there's clarification on that, declares that as not human subjects research. So you actually can, if you're able to use de-identified data from the beginning in your study, you may be able to just simply have a very short IRB application that says, these data do not have PII in them. I'm starting with de-identified data, and therefore, the common rule says it's not human subjects research. So, that's maybe a silver lining in all of this. But one of the concerns that I have also is errors. So if you share your data, what if you made a mistake somewhere? Then somebody could find it. So I don't know. Maybe I don't know if others worry about that, but I certainly do. But one thing that I found on my team is, ever since we started, sort of committing to sharing data, I've found that we're much more careful. In fact, we've found a lot of errors on the front end that maybe we wouldn't have known were there, but only because we knew that others would definitely be looking at our data and our code that we're sharing and so on. So so I find that as a benefit actually on the front end to the quality of our work. Another important concern is sort of getting scoop. So what if you share your data and then you submit an article from it, or you don't have time to write your article for a couple of years, and somebody else gets a hold of your data and does your study before you can. So there are ways to share your data and protect yourself from getting scooped. You can share it in data repositories and embargo it, for example, for a certain period of time. Or you can wait until you're far enough along the line toward publishing your results to share data. All that additional work, so learning to share data in a way that others can use in a meaningful way and understand what's there and not misinterpret it is something that we all need to learn how to do better. So there's this concept of a data dictionary. At a very minimum, you need to have a list of all of your variables in your data set. Ideally documentation on what they mean, what are the range of values that should be in those, how were the data generated, which kind of gets us to that open materials idea of if you can share all the details about how you collected data. So for example, if you have, say, race and ethnicity data, you should share information on like what were the options for how a person responded, right? Were they required to report their race or ethnicity? Were they required to select one and only one racial category or ethnic category? Could they select, were race and ethnicity two separate categories, or were they combined into one category? All those details will affect what the resulting data mean, right? And even then, it's difficult to interpret it can be difficult to interpret what the data mean. And so that's just one of myriad examples of why documentation of what your data are, what they represent, how they were collected, and so on. And that is not a small amount of work. When we're not sharing data, we can have all sorts of really bad habits of data documentation that you just can't get away with when you share data. So federal agencies have declared that they've increased the amount of some of their funding programs because of their data management plan requirements and their expectation for shared data. But we all still need to learn how to do that. And it's not something that's automatic. In fact, that may be the thing that I find the most difficult in my team. And then there's intellectual property concerns, as Kent had alluded to before also. So, but I don't want to go over time. Do I have until 9, Vicky? Sorry.
You have about 10 minutes left, and you're taking questions as you go. So, I mean, that works out, I think.
Okay. So I'll speak a little more briefly on some of these upcoming slides, but so one thing in the data management community, I'll just be very brief about this, but there's this acronym called the FAIR principles that these are sort of goals that we strive for in data sharing, and that's to make the data findable. So putting them in data repositories, for example, and using keywords and other ways to tag your data so that folks looking for those kinds of data can find them is one important principle. Accessible and interoperable. So it's a good idea to use open source software platforms like, if you're going to use statistical data, maybe you'll share it in a file that's readable by R, for example, or instead of using Excel even, Excel is fairly ubiquitous, but you could save it as a flat file using like .cds so that it's sort of readable, so that there's no licensing requirement, which can put up a barrier to somebody using your data. And the reusable part is really the documentation, having a data dictionary, having information on how the data were generated and so forth is really important, so that folks can interpret what they are and don't misinterpret it. And intellectual property is another thing you want to think about when you share your data. What kind of copyright do you want to put on it? So the one that I use most commonly is the Creative Commons by attribution copyright. So in other words, anyone in the world is welcome to use these data in whatever way you want to use. But I do ask one thing, that you provide an attribution of the source of the data, so I get a little credit for having shared it if you're using it. And the other aspect of Creative Commons is that you can't sort of take it and commercialize it and sort of sell it for your own financial gain. So some data repositories, and again, there are very general ones like Open Science Framework, and then there are domain specific ones. So this is just a brief list of them. It includes the OER Commons, as we mentioned on one of the first slides, is sort of a place to share. You can share lesson plans, you can share curriculum materials, you can share videos of lectures or things like that in OER Commons. GitHub tends to be more for more domain specific for sort of code, sharing code on things. LDBase is focused on developmental psychology and specifically trying to sort of do integrative work or sort of across different studies that are all studying the same construct and so forth. So there are a lot of different data repositories out there. Lately I'm really using Open Science Framework, which has pluses and minuses to it. But FSU is a partner in Open Science Framework. And I like the freedom and flexibility in there. Also, a key factor in that is I learned that they have a large enough financial endowment that they'll be around for long after I'm dead. And that's kind of important to me, that I don't do all this work to share data and then the website goes down and it all disappears. So those are just some of the data repositories. There are many more. But an important thing to think about is whether you want to put your data, share your data in a domain specific one, specific to the kind of work that you're doing, or a more general, broad repository. Some of these have requirements that you pay to put data there, and some don't. And of course, there's in between. Some have a certain amount of data that you can share, and then after you've shared a certain amount, you have to pay. The ICPSR is one of the oldest repositories, as I mentioned earlier. They also have curation services where their data management experts can look at your data and sort of give you feedback on how to make it more, more aligned to those FAIR principles and interpretable by others. And depending on your institution, if your institution's a partner, that may be free to you. If they're not, you may have to pay for that service. But so that's what I have to say on data sharing. Very briefly about open materials. I think there's a lot of benefits to sharing materials. And these are quick ones. Sort of full disclosure is an important one. Enables scrutiny, which is good and bad. But if we can manage to open ourselves up to that kind of scrutiny, I think it can make us better as individuals and the whole enterprise better. And it enables cooperation and comparison across studies. Is that thing you're calling, say, mathematical knowledge for teaching, is the way that you're measuring it, how does that compare to what I'm calling mathematical knowledge for teaching and how I'm measuring it? Are these two things commensurate, or are there important key differences in how we're measuring this construct? So that's one thing that sharing your measures can enable. I don't have much, definitely don't have time to talk about it, but in my lab, we develop a lot of measures, say of teacher knowledge, teacher beliefs, teacher math anxiety, of measures of instructional practice, and of student thinking and performance in math, student attitudes and math anxiety. And I'm sharing data for those through Open Science Framework. I'd be delighted to sort of share a direct link to that, but if you go to osf.io and search for data, you could search for by my name. You can see on this slide, these are a bunch of the tags. So I usually put the authors of the data set and the code that we use to analyze data there, and a number of other relevant, what I think are relevant tags. So I'd encourage you, I don't have time right now to explore in there, but I'd encourage you to go into OSF and look at some of these. What my lab, our ideal is we're sharing not just the data and things like data dictionaries, but we're also sharing what's called in other disciplines, the replication code. So if we're scoring a test, for example, we have the R code or the M+ code that we use to do all the data analysis. We're sharing that code. So even that can be valuable, where we can share ideas for how to write code to analyze data and how to do that better, and also how to reproduce the findings. And maybe you think we made a decision that's questionable and you would have made a different decision. You can go in there, rewrite the data analysis plan, take the same data and see how the results compare. So I mentioned a lot intellectual property once, and I'm going to leave that alone. But if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to the Creative Commons website and learn about all the different types of licenses for sharing things. So quick rhetorical question: how many of you have written an article and published it and then tried to access it, only to find that you can't access your own publication because there's a paywall? I know I have had that, and it is not a happy day when that happens. And it really underscores this sort of problem of undemocratic, unequal access to knowledge and research. So this brings me to open access publication. I'm a strong supporter of that, to a fault. In fact, I get dinged by my evaluation committees for putting things, say, not putting them in journals, but instead publishing them through digital. That's the FSU's open access repository for things. But I'd rather them be out there and accessible than and save me the trouble and frustration of dealing with reviewers sometimes. But there are a lot of types of open access publications. I think journals, now that the federal government is requiring open access publication, I think journals either need to create an open access option or become irrelevant in the future. But there are lots of different ways to do open access publications. So a journal, some journals are just already open access by default, like AERA Open. Other journals, you can pay extra money as the author for your article to be open access. So I've done that with a publication through School of Science and Mathematics, for example. I've published in AERA Open and another journal called Cogent Education, because they're dedicated open access journals. I also publish working papers. So I have a paper right now under review at a journal that does not have an open access option. So I just published my working paper in FSU's repository called Digital, and it's already published. And that very same manuscript is currently under review. But I checked with the journal, and that was not violating any of the journal's policies. So that's another way to expedite and make your work available to the public, and to avoid having it.
Dr. Schoen, I'm going to interrupt.
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Our next speakers are in the room, and
okay.
I want to thank you so much. This was so good. I appreciate you taking your time, and I'm pretty sure this is going to be viewed through our recording because this is just amazing information. So thank you
Great,
for sharing
thanks.
that.
Yeah, sorry to run out the clock.
You're fine. I'm going to turn it over to the, is